You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
Are you a 3CR subscriber?
We really need our listeners to subscribe to the station. It helps us remain financially independent and is an important part of our community governance.
It's just $40 concession, $80 waived, $150 for a band or organisation, and $300 solidarity.
Become a 3CR subscriber today.
3CR Radical Radio.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction, in the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning, death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed mind.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia on the National Community Radio Satellite. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. Listen to analysis of local, national, international events. Listen to analysis you'll never hear anywhere else.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. That's right, the Community Radio Network. North to south, east to west. Every city in the nation is able to listen to the Anarchist World This Week. It's also heard on the World Wide Web. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. This program is coming to you from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne. My name's Joseph Toscano. The introduction is so long, most likely the program's now over. If you wonder what Anarch is all about, Anarchos without rulers. It's a society without rulers, not without rules. What gives rulers the ability to determine the lives of millions, if not billions of people? Inequalities in power and wealth. So the anarchist struggle is the struggle to share power, possibly through direct democratic means, and the struggle to hold wealth in common. Obviously, the concepts are exceptionally simple. There's nothing radical about them. What's radical, in my opinion, is the fact that for thousands of years we have allowed rulers to determine the lives of billions of people. That, to me, is really radical. I mean, people taking back power is logical. Now, lots of things happening in the world today, obviously. If you're listening to me, you've got nothing better to do. Obviously, it is autumn. You could go out there and kind of play in the leaves. That's if you live in the southern half of Australia. If you live in the northern half of Australia, it's wet. Now, let's start off with, just start off something a bit funny but serious, because it is a serious world. You know, I was thinking that something's wrong when the good old days were the bad old days. You know, you start thinking, maybe it's a thing about age. You start thinking about the good old days. And when you really look at the good old days, they weren't that great. But compared to what people face today, they don't seem that bad at all. It's one of those conundrums that we face with. I mean, we may have lots of consumer goods, but we also have lots of debt. We may have lots of options, but we also have lots of confusion. We may think that with greater freedoms, but the fact is that over the last 50 years, 60 years, the amount of legislation which has gone through federal parliament and state parliaments which curtail people's liberties and freedoms are just extraordinary. We may think that we're financially better off, but the reality is that most people may feel they're financially better off because they've got more gadgets and goodies to look at, but the reality is that we've never had a society where so many people have been in so much debt. And the list goes on and on. So something to reflect on. Were the bad old days as bad as we thought they were? And are the good, and have we reached the situation where we now have a situation, I use the word situation twice, that's unfortunate. We now have a situation, I've used it a third time, where people are beginning to think that maybe the course we've been on for the last half a century, the deregulation, privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation journey that we've undertaken as a people has been the wrong journey. You've only got to look at the climate emergency. But these are things to think about. When we start thinking of the good old days as the bad old days, we have a problem. And that problem is structural. It's fundamental. It's about how the society is structured. And nothing highlights this more than youth crime. Now, obviously, you're getting lots of pickies about what's been happening in Alice Springs. And there's lots of people with lots of ideas about what to do, not just in Alice Springs, but about the burgeoning rate of youth crime. And we're all talking about, harsher sentences, more jails, all those type of things, making parents responsible. But nobody seems to mention the P word, poverty. The P word. Because what poverty does, it actually limits options. And when we talk about 1 million children in this country living below the poverty line and charities springing up to ensure Australian kids going to public schools have enough resources to access those public schools, you begin to think there is a problem. So the P word, poverty. We like to think about disadvantage, not exploitation. We like to think about, differences, sexuality, gender, race, religion, you name it. But we don't mention the P word, poverty. The effects that poverty, and the word poverty means lack of options. I was talking to somebody on a disability support pension, which is the best pension in Australia. It's not much good, but it is the best compared to, say, other social security benefits. And when he was telling me what poverty is about, it's not having enough. It's not about not having enough food to eat, and maybe not even having a roof over your head, but it's ultimately about what you can do and what you can't do. You can't go to the pictures with your friends. You can't join a sporting club. There are no venues which you can attend apart from gambling venues and places where, you've got to spend money. So poverty limits options. And when children are exposed to all the fancy consumer goods that other children have access to, and when children find that their parents don't have the disposable income to actually provide them with the basic necessities of life, things break down. This is nothing new. The whole point about the revolutionary movements during the late the 19th and 20th century was about removing poverty from society. That's what the social security system was supposed to be all about. It wasn't about creating a subsistence environment. So, obviously, there are victims of crime. And if you're a victim of crime, it's very difficult to think outside your personal circumstances because you are personally affected. And it's easy to talk about harsher sentences and, draconian laws, more police. But even the police are saying, look, this is not a policing problem. I mean, we're there to police, but what we are seeing is not a policing problem. What we are seeing is a social problem, a community problem, a political problem. Because for far too long, we as a community have decided there is a disposable section of each generation which we don't provide for, which find themselves on the outer. And it's no wonder we're having an escalation of youth crime in this country, not just in the Northern Territory, but in every capital city, every regional centre. Then you include social media in this, the availability of drugs, the exploitation of young people through the use of drugs, and the list goes on and on. So, isn't it about time we brought back the P word at the forefront of the struggle against youth crime? Because if we addressed poverty, if we address the problem of limited options as a community, not have a knee-jerk reaction every time some horrific crime occurs in the community, then maybe we wouldn't have that level of criminality increasing, levels of criminality increasing among young people. It's something, to think about. Because obviously you treat the symptoms, it's like a disease. Patient comes in, they tell you all the symptoms, you give them this tablet for that symptom, that tablet for this symptom, this tablet for that symptom, that potion for this symptom, send them off for a nice big chemist bill. 6 months later they're dead. Because although you treated the symptoms, you haven't treated the cause of the symptoms. And the key is, if you don't treat the cause of the symptoms, you will continue to have an escalation in the problems. And this is not just an Indigenous problem, in inverted commas. It's a society-wide problem, especially among children who believe and know, not just believe, know they have no future in our society because we are not willing as a society to make the effort financially and socially to provide a pathway via which they have a future, because education, which everybody talks about, is no longer that pathway, especially if the education process is basically there to babysit, not educate. You listen to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. Now, let's go to the Middle East. Obviously, it's something you can't ignore. Remember the little trip we take every week on the Anarchist World this week? We do our little jog. It used to be a walk, a short walk, but it's a jog now. 33 kilometres long, every metre, a body of a man, woman and child. 1/3 or 40%, more than 1/3, children under 18, dead. It's nice looking at body bags, isn't it? Because when you look at a body bag, you imagine what's in the body bag. It's different to actually looking at what has actually happened to an individual basically going about their business. Because, you see, the Gazan butchers, and that's what they are, the Israeli fascist state. I mean, if some other country was doing this, we'd all be up in arms. Now, obviously in Australia, Zomi Frankum, a care worker, died yesterday, as well as 6 of her colleagues and a few Palestinian drivers, I think. And people think, well, it's an accident of war. Mistakes happen. We call it collateral damage. Just in case you've forgotten, the Vietnam War and the Iraqi War, and the list goes on. Collateral damage. But the fact is that aid in the Gaza carnage, and I don't want to use the word war. This is not a war. Let's get this right. I mean, I want to paint a picture for you. This is an area half the size of Sydney or half the size of Melbourne, with half the population of Sydney or Melbourne. It's a small, confined area. Obviously, there are people in this area who have arms, and because of a 70-year history of occupation, broke out, right? And there were issues. People were killed. People were taken as hostages. But the fact is, this carnage is totally as a consequence of the actions of the Israeli fascist government. Totally. Remember, the Gaza Strip of 2.5 million people had been blockaded by the Israeli government for over 16 years, which had the audacity to elect Hamas as their government, irrespective of whether it's listed as a terrorist organisation. They were elected by the people of Gaza because the people of Gaza had lost hope, any hope of their lives improving. So the Gazan butchers are now under a little bit of international pressure. Not that they care that much about international pressure, but there is that international pressure. What's happened is the State of Israel and its citizens have become the 21st century pariahs of the globe through their own actions. And targeting aid workers is not new. It's been happening since the 7th of October. Aid workers have been killed in the past and have been targeted because there are many fascists in the Israeli cabinet who see giving aid to Palestinian civilians as some type of war crime. And they don't want any aid. And it's not unusual for rogue elements of the Israeli military to act on their own behalf, beholden not to the government, but to actual factions within cabinet. So the targeting of aid workers is not unusual in this conflict. The fact that an Australian aid worker, great humanitarian, great human being, who devoted many years of her life to providing aid in the most difficult places in the world, somebody of tremendous courage that I don't possess, was killed, has highlighted the situation. But we don't want this just to be a one-day wonder. Now, the Israeli fascist government does not care what you think. They don't care how often you march. They don't care how long your vigils are. But they do care about a number of things which we, as enablers, that's right, we, the West, the United States, the Australian government, we are enablers. We have enabled the Israeli fascist government to carry out these war crimes because they say they have the right to defend themselves. Now, let's not forget the breakout from Gaza of Gaza militants was a total lack of failure of the Israeli fascist government to protect its citizens. They were too busy forcefully acquiring land in the West Bank and East Jerusalem to actually have enough security around Gaza. And the world's greatest intelligence agency, Mossad, had no inkling about what was about to occur on the 7th of October. No inkling. So it was a total failure of the Israeli state, the Israeli fascist government, to protect its citizens, which means that the hostages still remain in Gaza. And the Israeli fascist government has no interest in its own hostages. It's obvious to anybody with a quarter of a brain, even one synapse neuron, that unless there's a permanent ceasefire, not one hostage that remains in Gaza will leave that zone alive. It's obvious. And the Israeli fascist government has made the calculation that it is willing to let those hostages die. No wonder tens of thousands of Israelis are now beginning to question this carnage. Because their actions have created a situation where the membership of Hamas continues to rise and future generations will continue that struggle because of the brutality of the response. And the fact that we continue to enable this to occur. Now, it took the death of one Australian for the Israeli ambassador to be called in for an explanation. There was no explanation for the death of 32,000 Palestinians, mostly civilians, 98% civilians. No explanation. And the situation has become so difficult that the Israeli government, or the fascist government, has now targeted the Iranian consulate in Damascus. Could you imagine if somebody targeted the Australian consulate in London? The reaction? We would be automatically at war. Now, the Gazan butchers know that. They know that they're losing support. And what they're concerned about is not they're losing support internationally, but they will not be able to get the armaments they use. Although the United States government continues to support them with planes and bombs and the latest technology for their the atrocities that have been committed on behalf of the Israeli fascist state in Gaza. So they have a philosophy or a policy or an ideology of extending this war because they want to draw the United States into this war by obliterating the Iranian consulate in Damascus. What they're hoping is that the Iranian government will react in such a way as to force the United States to enter the conflict on their side. That's what that strike was about, and that's why it's so dangerous. Because they're trying to prod Big Brother to give them a hand. Because they may have overwhelming technology, but the number of people they have is minuscule to the number of people in the Middle East. Minuscule. Irrespective of the support they have internationally. So what are a few things which can be done by the Australian government so that we are not enablers of these atrocities? Now, people talk about a war. It is not a war. One side's got handguns and maybe some rockets. That's one side. The other side has naval forces which bombard an area half the size of Melbourne. Unlimited jets which can bomb any time they like. Tanks, bulldozers, the latest technology, and the list goes on and on. This is not a war, this is carnage. It's atrocity after atrocity after atrocity. They think they can actually eliminate Hamas as a political force without addressing the issue of colonisation and displacement of Palestinians, which the creation of Israel caused. So what can we do? First of all, we can ask demand the Australian government expel the Israeli ambassador. Not just call him for a little bit of cup of tea and address him there, but expel the Israeli ambassador. Secondly, we can ask for a complete ban on any trade with the Israeli state. Complete ban. You can already start your own personal boycott, but a complete ban. And thirdly, there are people in the Israeli armed forces, especially the conscripts, who are beginning to question what they are doing in Gaza. Because this is not a war, this is carnage. So we should be offering any Israeli soldier who's had enough, any of the men and women involved in these atrocities on behalf of the Israeli fascist state, political asylum in this country. No questions asked, political asylum for any Israeli member of the armed forces who decides enough is enough and wants to get out of the situation. Offer them political asylum. Think about it. Not much we can do. They don't care what you say, how long you march, whether you walk up and down that 33-kilometre strip, counting all the bodies. They don't care. But they do care if their own citizens begin to question what they are doing and refuse to take part in the carnage. They do care very strongly about that, because obviously in any situation, if the people who are sent in to create the carnage begin to have questions about what's happening and refuse to carry out those orders, that Israeli fascist cabinet has a lot of issues to face. Listen to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. My name's Joseph Toscano. Yeah, look, social media, legacy media, people think there's a difference. It's not. They're both masters of divisive language. Masters of divisive language. And that's the key. We kind of lurch as a society and as a community, from disaster to disaster to disaster to disaster. Today's disaster is tomorrow's fish and chip wrapper. But there is this litany of divisive language. And we see this constantly. And it's a divisive language which is basically directed at elements in society who are considered to be a threat, whether it's existential or real, to those who exercise power. And the great thing about being an Australian is we love to get involved in those divisive debates about peripheral issues. But when it comes to the central issues of who exercises power, who has wealth, what's been happening, why it's been happening, there's no debate. No discussion. Just divisive language. Yeah, 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 yeah. You know, divisive language, pointing constantly. It's just extraordinary. The amount of divisive language, as if, you know, we're all different little groups in society and somehow we're defined by our sexual identity or defined by our gender or defined by our race or defined by the colour of our skin or what clothes we wear. And somehow we all have different needs. And the fact is, if I cut open a body, and I've cut open enough bodies in my life to realise that, it doesn't matter what person's sexual identity is, or sexuality, or colour. I expect to find a heart, 2 kidneys, a pancreas, a duodenum, a colon, a stomach, 2 lungs, a brain, and the list goes on and on. Obviously, there's an exceptionally small percentage that may have some type of genetic issue, abnormality, but ultimately, we're all part of the same species, the Cro-Magnon species. And somehow we use religion or nationality or culture to think that we are somehow different from somebody else. Now, obviously, there are cultural differences and there are gender issue differences. But the fact is that ultimately, we all need the same things. Ultimately. But we forget that. Yep, that's the beauty, isn't it, of having a sovereign nation state. That somehow that makes us different to somebody else who's in another sovereign nation state. And that gives us the right to destroy them. It seems to be the story of the human race. Maybe if some Martians came down here, they could sort us out. Because we can't seem to sort ourselves out. Well, we can sort ourselves out. That's what anarchism is all about. But while we continue to bow and scrape and follow rulers or let them push us around, we will continue to face the same issues. We'll continue, our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren will be continued to be sacrificed on the altar of Mammon. Sacrificed for those who exercise power, supposedly on our behalf. So there is wholesale change in thinking that's required. But whether we're willing to make those changes is a different matter because, as I said before, social media, legacy media, all about devices, the language of divisiveness. Them, us, them, us, them, us. You know, it's them overseas, those coming here, this, that, them, us. Extraordinary. We've forgotten about our common humanity. Forgotten about it completely. You listen to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. And when we forget about common humanity, what happens? We begin to worship authoritarian leaders, hoping they have the solution to what are essentially structural problems. How can a society of 26 million people living on a continent, resource-rich, find itself in the situation we find ourselves today? This should be the land of milk and honey. This should be a modern-day utopia, not a dystopia for some. It's not. And it's not because of what I said initially at the beginning of this program. Inequalities in power and wealth. It's about inequalities in power and wealth. It's not about identity politics. It's about inequalities in power and wealth. That's what gives small groups of people the ability to manipulate large groups to go and commit atrocities on their behalf to ensure they continue to control society. And that's the issue. Whether it's in Russia or Australia or, Lum Land, wherever that is, that is the issue. I'll give you an example. And now currently, the Fair Work Commission, I like that name, it's almost Orwellian. Well, it is Orwellian. The Fair Work Commission is being asked to make a deliberation regarding I think it's 800,000 Australians on the basic wage, which is about around $880 a week. Enough to pay your rent, if you're lucky. Now, we have three groups of people which are making submissions, which are allowed to make submissions to the Fair Work Commission as it goes about its work. All right? We've got the Australian government, which said it would like to see the basic wage increased by the rate of inflation. In other words, stand still. Then we have the ACTU, which represents the trade unions, which are calling for, I think it's a 5.8% rise in the basic wage, which is a little bit above inflation. And then we've got the employers, all the employer associations, and they want a 2% wage rise. What I love about the employer associations, they always rub their hands and they have their little crocodile tears when they talk about small business. Well, they don't give a shit about small business. They're the very people that destroy small business through unfair competition. They're the very people that are the bane of the small business sector, although the small business sector thinks the bane of its life is its employees who actually create its wealth. Well, they want 2%. Now, if I lined up every bloody executive in every corporation or private company in this country and asked them what their wage rise had been in the last 12 months, it would approximate 15%. And that doesn't include share options in the company car, fringe benefits, and the list goes on and on. Extra superannuation. And now they have the audacity to say the people on the basic wage who can't even meet their day-to-day commitments, the working poor, should get an increase of 2%. And what's even more extraordinary is that they've got a smile on their face when they say it. It will destroy business. It's always small business. Tears in their eyes while they've got a smile on their face. When we know that the greatest destroyers of small business in this country are not the people that work for small business, but the actual corporations which we have allowed to be so dominant, so large, that we need legislation to ensure there's a little bit of competition. And that's the beauty of capitalism, isn't it? Private investment for private profit. If you've got no regulation, what happens is you get bigger. Small companies eat big companies, eat small companies, eat bigger companies, eat a small. It just goes on and on until you get 2 or 3 corporations, as we see in the food sector, as we see in the hardware sector, as we see in most aspects of human existence. You go into a bloody shopping mall, something I try to avoid, but go into a shopping mall, same corporations. And those few small businesses that exist are usually find themselves that they can't compete. And somebody else who's had a dream of being independent loses their home. Extraordinary. And you know why all this is happening? Because you know what the perfect citizen is in the 21st century world, not just Australia, the 21st century world. What we want is cantankerous, cringing, carping, complaining consumers who are only interested in consumption, whether it's the consumption of services, whether it's consumption of goods. For example, social media, all that divisiveness. What's it about? It's about getting your eyeballs on to advertisements. It's about crafting advertisements to suit your day-to-day wants and needs. That's what it's about. I mean, we've been reduced as a people to cantankerous, because, you know, it's not good having debt. You get cantankerous, you get angry, cringing. Oh, if I complain too much, maybe there's a problem. Carping, you know, talking about it under your breath, complaining, consumers. The perfect 21st century citizen, apolitical, no understanding or interest. It's not about understanding or interest any outside consumption. We are so saddled with personal debt that we have become modern day slaves. I know it sounds a bit extreme. Instead of being fed slop, we're now fed shit. That's right. And the perfect citizen, whether it's communist China, whether it's Russia, whether it's Israel, whether it's, you know, Australia, is the cantankerous, cringing, carping, complaining consumer. The perfect citizen, apolitical, not interested in what's going on, you know, blaming somebody else for the situation they find themselves in, but never looking at the wider picture. Why do 1 million children live in poverty in a resource-rich country? Why have over the past 40 to 50 years the gap between the rich and poor in this country increased, abnormally increased, not by a few percentages, but what percent? Why have the social elevator been destroyed? Why is it we have increased youth crime? Obviously, if there's no social elevator and kids think they've got no future, there will be increased youth crime. Why is it every time we talk about the resources of this country being used to look after the interests of the people of this country's First Nations people and the rest of us, why is it that there is never any movement? Why is it that we elect people into Parliament, the same political groups, time and time again, or we elect groups that are about dividing us on the basis of culture or race or where we come from or where we were born? Why do we as a people continue to be cantankerous, cringing, carping, complaining consumers? Well, obviously everything around us is about moulding us into cantankerous, cringing, carping, complaining consumers. That's what we're moulded to be. That's our future. That's what a 21st century citizen is about. It's not about rights and responsibilities. It's not about enjoying life. It's about consumption. It's a tragedy. It's a great tragedy. The tragedy has become so acute that we now face a climate emergency because of an economic system which is based on creating profits irrespective of the human, social, environmental costs. Why is this love affair with authoritarian movements? It's because parliamentary democracy has been shown to be a total sham. Total sham. And it's not the fault. It's our fault as a people because we believe the same propaganda because we are encased. That's right, from morning to night. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every month, every year, we're encased in a propaganda, and that's all it is, a propaganda plastic bubble which says good is bad, bad is good. It makes George Orwell's 1984 and Brave New World look like a picnic. That's the situation we find ourselves in. And we continue to worry, as a people, we continue to worry about the other. When it's not the other we should be worried about. It should be worried about those elements in society which have created these increasing gaps in the community. As I said at the beginning of the program, something's very wrong when the good old days were the bad old days. Something is very wrong in our society. And if there is no mechanism via which to make major parliamentary legislative changes to challenge deregulation and challenge privatisation and challenge globalisation and challenge corporatisation, change will never occur. Never. It just doesn't occur. That's the reality. Change does not occur while we continue as a whole to be cantankerous, cringing, carping, complaining consumers. I know I sound like a, negative, but I'm very positive today. And I'll tell you why I'm positive today. I'm positive because things are changing. Not in terms of identity politics, not in terms of economics, but in terms of people beginning to question the ability of a parliamentary or representative democracy to actually address the problems they face as individuals and we face as communities if they are not in a position to pass legislation which improves the lives of people. The solution isn't to latch on to some authoritarian leader or, potential ruler who claims to have all the solutions lie in our individual hands. Not as individuals, but as communities. Look at the economy. We have an economy which is dominated by the private sector. If it's dominated by the private sector, there's no competition. Housing is a classical example. Classical example. Why don't we have enough housing? Is it because there are too many people? Is it because there aren't enough tradespeople? Is it because there is no competition in the private sector because all housing, or the majority of housing in the country today, is owned by the private sector? I mean, Victoria, which is the state I'm most familiar with, is a classical example. For the last 30 years, successive Labor governments, as well as one Liberal government, have been hell-bent on privatising the public housing sector. Now, I know I'm not brilliant, and neither are you because you're listening to the Anarchist World this week. They think we're stupid. But even stupid people like us know that in order to have competition, you need different sectors of the economy. You need an economy which is based on the private sector. You need an economy which is based on the public sector, an economy which is based on collectives and cooperatives. If you don't have that competition, what you've got is an ever-increasing, that's right, ever-increasing profitability made by the private sector because there's no competition. I'm not talking as an anarchist, I'm just talking as just a boring old economist, which I'm not. I'm old and boring, but I'm not an economist. So you increase the public housing sector. For example, if you use stamp duty revenue, you could house 100,000 Victorians in public housing every year through a buyback scheme or through, a new building scheme. You increase the public housing sector. That increases competition with the private sector. What that means is that people who, because of legislation, are in the housing game, thinking they're going to enrich themselves through capital gains, will move out of that sector. Housing prices will decrease at the lower end of the sector. More houses will be available for rent. Less people will need to rent. And the list goes on and on. It's simple. But trying to get anybody to talk about public housing in 2024 is almost impossible, at least in this state, because of pressure which we've applied and which have now the Greens have taken up, that the Greens in the Victorian Parliament, in the upper house, have been able to get enough support over the last 2 weeks to pass legislation to conduct a 2-year inquiry, which will take them up to the next state election, regarding the lack of public housing, what's happened to public housing in this state. Because the solutions are simple. There's no such thing as a difficult solution, especially in this country. I mean, maybe if we lived in Gaza, things would be difficult. But we do live in Australia. Resource-rich continent, 26 million people. No bombs. Nobody trying to starve us. Easy. Have you been listening to The Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network? This program has been streaming on 3cr.org.au. The program is a podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. If you're interested in those ideas, I encourage you to become a member of public interest before corporate interests. PIBCI. Go to PIBCI, PIBCI.net. You can join online. We're having a congress on Saturday, I think it's the 4th of May, at the Unitarian Church in East Melbourne. That's a Saturday. So if you want to be part of the Congress, unfortunately only PIBCI members are invited, although you can come as an observer but you don't have any voting rights. Join PIBCI. Now, if you don't love computers, you can always leave a message on 0439 395 489, or you can actually write to Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. Thank you for listening to The Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. My name's Joseph Toscano. The program is podcasts. You can go to 3cr.org.au. Facebook pages, public interest before corporate interests. Joseph Toscano, Toscano for the public. YouTube channels, josephtoscano.num or public interest before corporate interest. The list goes on and on. Go on the net, do something. We'll talk to you next week. Keep your hopes up. Thank you, everybody, for listening to the Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station, courtesy of the Community Radio Network.
Minds that plot destruction. Sorcerer of death's construction.
3CR is radical radio, and that means more than just alternative current affairs and political coverage.
We're radical because we're an independent media outlet, owned and operated by the community.
We're radical because we give communities the control of their own shows, with their own music, in their own languages.
We're radical because we provide a media platform for communities to build their own power to create social change.
Become a subscriber and support Radical Radio. Call us on 03 9419 8377 or subscribe online at 3cr.org.au/subscribe.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.